Prime Minister Justin Trudeau used his COP26 speech to announce a federal oil and gas emissions cap. Now that opens up a Pandora's box, because how is he going to do it? How is Alberta going to react? How will the industry react? Is it going to go well? Is it going to be a national unity crisis? All sorts of questions. We know how the federal government operates, and we know how Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta operates, but oil and gas culture, how the CEOs think and what they say behind closed doors is a bit of a black box. So I'm going to talk to Eric Denhoff, who was the Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Alberta from, I think it was 2016 to 2018 or 19. And he is sat across from these folks. So he's going to tell us what his experience is like. So welcome to the interview, Eric.
Thanks very much, Markham. Happy to be here.
Well, look, what's it like sitting across from the CEOs of the big oil and gas companies and negotiating with them?
Yeah, I think they have obviously different interests than the governments, provincial or federal, have, or even than the general public has. So, when, for example, the Alberta government was negotiating a cap on oil sands production, which was 100 emissions, which was 100 megatons. It was really intriguing to see the jockeying and the challenges that arose for industry, because basically what they sell all day is they don't really sell oil, they don't really sell gas, they sell hope and future production increase. And so what they're selling to their investors, whether they're retail or institutional, is we're going to grow, and our growth is going to pay for X, Y, and Z, and a nice return to you. When they don't have the growth story any longer, the kind of dramatic growth story, people forget Alberta's doubled its oil production in a little over a decade. When they don't have that narrative, there is no narrative to justify building big new oil sands plants. There's no narrative to justify a big new Montney, or whatever. So when you put in any kind of cap, emissions cap or production cap, several things happen. People start to look at, how am I going to raise money now, but also, is my project, I've got an approved project. Me and 5 other folks have approved projects. Whose project's still going to get to go ahead, if any? Because the cap often allows for some growth, but it just screws it down so that within a few years you can't do much. Well, what happens then is, what if your project was approved a decade ago with crappy old technology that we know today is really, medieval by comparison on emissions? But a new guy who hasn't yet approved comes along, or a new woman CEO with a brilliant new technology that could produce the same volume of production for half of the emissions, a quarter of the emissions. Who gets that last mile, of approvals? So they're going to be terrified in an artificial sense, in that their salaries are based, their share price is based, and their narrative is based on endless growth. The reality is they have neither the pipeline capacity, not because of evil governments everywhere, but because they've lost the sort of social contract worldwide. So they don't have the capacity, even if they increase production anyway, to move much more out over time. And ESG investors aren't going to allow them to keep growing and growing and growing anyway and invest. So you start to move to sloppier second-tier investors who typically charge more money for the risk. And you have a corporate culture in Calgary that just doesn't like growth limitations, right? Culturally.
Now, I've interviewed Wood Mackenzie on this a couple of times. They argue that the oil and gas companies are going to do well in the 2020s because of this underinvestment in production. They have trouble getting capital. So prices are going to be up, and that means more revenue. But then after 2030, then it all falls off the table. And so the argument is, you're going to have money to do 2 things during the 2020s. Right. One is pivot to a low carbon business model, and B, clean up your environmental liabilities while you still have cash in the drawer to do it. And I often think of that analysis when I think of the Alberta oil sands companies, because they have huge environmental liabilities. And they have the problems with growth, as you mentioned. How is that all going to play into it?
Well, I think it's going to be a very difficult environment, because the oil companies used to come into Edmonton and throw their weight around and say, if you don't do this, you don't do that, we're going to either close down the plant in Cold Lake or Fort McMurray or wherever, or we're going to stop drilling, or we're going to move our capital to the US or some foreign clients. And that was always the threat. And as you know, and the jobs that went with that, all these new construction jobs or the existing jobs. And so what's happened is twofold. And then they would go to Ottawa and they would turn on the same afterburners and endless lobbying with Ottawa, and you could see the record of lobbying there. Well, now there's no point going to Ottawa to lobby. There's nobody there that's going to listen to you. And in Edmonton, there's not a lot of point just lobbying Edmonton now because nobody's listening to Edmonton. Edmonton's listening to industry, but the world isn't listening to Edmonton. Alberta's in for a very dark situation because the corporate CEOs are realizing they're going to have a great deal of difficulty attracting new capital for more projects and new growth, even if there wasn't a cap, because investors just want to make more money on the existing assets and squeeze it out. What you see really is people who are going to cut and run. Now, I don't mean like tomorrow afternoon, but people will look at their 30-year asset and say at the end of 30 years, they're not reinvesting. And there is no bond right now in place. They probably have security of $1 billion or something with the provincial government on somewhere between 70 and 260 billion of liabilities. What's the incentive for either the government of Alberta or the oil companies to clean up all that mess in a declining asset period? The government will have less and less revenue, and there's little return in terms of jobs for them. There won't be big new 5,000 person construction jobs on a new oil sands plant. And as you well know better than anybody, they're automating all the jobs that do exist, so there won't even be, that continuing narrative. So I think it's actually going to be a very, very difficult time. Even if Trudeau was out of the equation and we didn't have oil production caps and gas caps, the world's going to impose them, whether it's in a year or 3 years or 5 years. So the long term is very dark, in my view. The medium term could be quite good for some Alberta companies, as you highlight. But for the taxpayer, I think a real nightmare. Declining revenues over time, huge liabilities, and it's about as bad a story as you can get.
Well, look, as I said in my introduction, you've sat across the table from the CEOs. You know some of them personally, and do these guys get it? And I've also heard that they are kind of entitled and a bit like pirates. They're negotiate. They're hard. They're aggressive, right? They're not. These are not shrinking violets when they get to the negotiating table. So, is that your experience with them?
Well, absolutely. And the problem is you have people who negotiate all over the world, extremely experienced negotiators on multi-billion-dollar deals, not just in Alberta, but these guys are international, either companies or they have international experience negotiating everywhere. So to them, the Alberta government's no different than, Venezuela or Nigeria or Kazakhstan or anywhere, and they're used to getting what they want historically if they just are aggressive enough. And they are bullies. I mean, you could be nice about it, but the nicer ones, the more elegant ones, like to play poker, basically. I mean, it's kind of a national sport in Calgary anyway. So, chuck wagon and poker. And the problem is you have a lot of part-time government people. There are MLAs who come and go, cabinet ministers who have typically very little experience negotiating at this level. And so they buy the threats, if, my riding is going to lose 1,000 jobs if I don't agree with these guys, or my donation base is going to dry up because the workers are going to be mad at me or whatever. They're immediately responsive to almost any threat that's telegraphed. My experience was when you said to them, look, settle down, we're not doing this, this is crazy. Let's come up with a plan that works for both sides here. And you held firm. In fact, they would start to come around in many, many cases, not all of them. I mean, to be perfectly blunt, I always felt CNRL were the most truculent and transigent and difficult to deal with for whatever reason. And if you talk to people in the oil patch, they'll say the same thing, even when they negotiate with them. But they're all very difficult to deal with because they've been spoiled for a long time. They've had it their own way for a long, long time. So it's a culture, yeah. Well,
in that context, then, what do you make of the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau appointed Stephen Guilbeault, a former Greenpeace activist, as the new environment minister? Is this a shot across the bow of bully CEOs?
I don't know. I wasn't the biggest fan of the appointment, not because of the Alberta context really at all. I think the appointment was probably made more with a nose to Quebec votes, where he's very popular, sort of legendary figure, and to the Liberal base and the NDP and Green voters. Where my concern about his appointment was the message that he's able to deliver coherently to the great Canadian middle class as we move towards $170 carbon pricing, as we move towards enhanced low carbon fuel, initiatives, clean fuel standard, and all that sort of thing. I thought that Wilkinson had a very deft ability to get along at a reasonable level with the business community and be understood by the average Joe and Josephine, and also have credibility with the NGOs in the environmental community. When you put the resume of Legault in there, it's not that the resume isn't fabulous. It is, and he's a very hardworking, great, very bright guy. He did awful on the heritage file. I don't know if you saw some of those clips of him trying to defend the internet legislation, but if you have a chance, go back and look at one or two of them. And he was like a deer in the headlights. I mean, he was not able to explain remotely why that legislation should go through. If he ends up, and hopefully it won't, because obviously he knows the environment file way better, but if he ended up with that same inability in convincing Canadians on this file, it would be a tragedy. So it's a gamble. I don't think it was personally directed at Alberta. I really don't. I know they hate it, but Wilkinson's very tough. He was not a slouch for Alberta to deal with. I think they found that he'd been a CEO before. He had business credentials as well as environmental ones, sort of a more moderate in the classic liberal fashion. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see whether the new whether Gibault can translate, to this portfolio in a way that he didn't at Heritage. So yeah, we'll see.
Well, Eric, always a pleasure, and thank you very much for the insight into a culture that very often, this goes on behind closed boardroom doors. We don't get a peek in, so thank you very much for that.
Not at all. Anytime. Thanks, Markham. Good luck.